notice how winding your window down by hand makes you look lower middle class?
There's one way to cut through today's computer clutter.
With call waiting from New York Telephone, important calls can get through.
The 70s will always be remembered as the era that ushered in great music, fashion, technology, and scientific advances with the creation of computing devices that won the hearts of many. However, several other things about this era brought frustration, anxiety, and disdain. Here are a few things from the 70s that you certainly hated. Most people who were around in the 70s were aware of how bad the gasoline rationing was, but not everyone knew the extent of how tough it was to live in that period. Here's what really happened. The fuel crisis was first triggered by the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Because of America's allegiance to Israel during the war, the opposing side, which was the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to impose an oil export embargo on the United States and other nations. This led to a massive reduction of oil exports to the United States. Because of this, oil and gas prices went through the roof in a short period of time and were also very limited. To tackle this problem, the United States had to implement the rationing of gasoline. Queues at filling stations were an endless centipede of cars. Since there was no fuel, it became difficult to drive your own vehicle. Many had to rely on public transportation. The government initiated a rationing plan, which allowed odd and even-numbered license plates to buy fuel on different days. So, if you ended up missing your day, you had to stick to public transport until your appointed day came back around. Needless to say, inflation was at its all-time high, and the economy faced its toughest challenges yet. This also helped to increase awareness of energy conservation and consideration for sustainable energy. Fuel stations were shut down in some areas, and there were limits to purchases. Speed limits were imposed on a national level. Even though the embargo was lifted in 1974, the effects lingered on throughout the decade until the mid-80s. Today's television channels are inexhaustible, providing 24-hour entertainment for every demographic, yet most people still desire streaming services and other extra entertainment. Now imagine a time when you only had the option of 4 to 7 channels on television. The 70s had limited TV channels, and the numbers depended on your location. So, it could be more or less. Most households had only primary networks like PBS, NBC, ABC, and CBS, and there was just a handful of popular shows, so if you got bored, you didn't have many options except to sit it out. Shows aired at designated times following specific schedules, and if you missed your favorite show, there was no way to catch up later. You only depended on a stroke of luck for a repeat broadcast. The TV stations would sign off at late hours, and the screen would be replaced by a colorful screensaver until morning, when the programs returned at a specific time. The lack of variety and geographical limitations made the 70s TV watching an unsatisfying experience.
Helene Kaufman, a pack and a half to 2-pack a day smoker for 17 years.
In the 1970s, the scent of tobacco was one thing you couldn't avoid. Public smoking was legal and socially accepted, so you'd always find people smoking everywhere you went. The location didn't matter. Whether it was the office, in parks, on the road, or even at home, you'd always find a few people letting off steam in their free time. Kids were exposed to the smoke and were even sent on errands to buy cigarettes from the local store with a note from their parents and a handful of cash. There were so many cigarette ads on TV promoting the product with little to no awareness of the dangers of smoking. And as time went by, the prevalence of smoking led to numerous public health issues. Laws were put into place to protect non-smokers from respiratory diseases, and more strict rules were put on tobacco products to protect the environment. One of the frustrating things about the 70s was waiting for the phone before you could make a call. Many households only had a single landline, which was usually located in the central part of the living room. If someone was already on a call, you had to wait for your turn no matter the urgency, and if you were expecting a call, you probably wouldn't know when the call came in. The caller ID didn't exist at that time, and it only added to the anxiety of waiting for an important call. Some areas used a party line, And the problem with that was you had to share the same line with your neighbors, so whenever you picked up the phone, you couldn't make a call unless your neighbor was done. On the flip side, party lines had no privacy at all, so you could just listen in on your neighbors' conversations. This possibility would get them to get off the phone faster to avoid discussing their business on the open line.
Join the cassette browsers at Woolies. Get 35p off. James Lost. Johnny Math.
8-track tapes were revolutionary in the 1970s and offered a way to listen to music from anywhere that you were. The audio format was a precursor to cassette tapes. They were, at that time, the hottest music storage technology, but their shortcomings only became all too clear when cassettes and CDs were made. The plastic cartridge was commonly used in cars, portable players, and home stereos, and was way more convenient than vinyl records since they didn't require flipping and could play on a loop. The problem with 8-track tapes was their poor sound quality, which didn't match the vinyl records. Besides that, the tape heads easily got misaligned, and it was often a bulky inconvenience. You'd probably hate how the tape abruptly changes tracks in the middle of a song. It was also tough to control playback and fast forward, and thanks to new forms of music systems, the 8-track quickly went out of the market, unlike vinyl records which stuck around for many years.
But when it comes to waterbeds, some people don't like waves.
The concept of a bed that's full of water on the inside was a huge deal in the 1970s, a countercultural movement that introduced an unconventional lifestyle. It was presented as luxury furniture, and everyone added owning a waterbed to their bucket list. Waterbeds were a bed-shaped vinyl material containing several interconnected water chambers and were marketed as the ultimate sleeping comfort. It was designed in the 60s, became popular in the 70s with movies and advertisements that showed how comfortable and unique that these water bags were. However, owning a waterbed wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. The hype would be short-lived when people began going back to traditional beds. Waterbeds were heavy and difficult to move, prone to leakage, and that could cause flooding, and it became a nightmare for people with back pain and other sleeping problems. The wobbly nature didn't allow for actual sleep, and if one person even dared to stir while sleeping, everyone was awake for the next hour. If the weather was cold, you might want to heat up that bed or you'd freeze while sleeping, and in the end, it was just way too much trouble. One of the most iconic examples of unconventional design choice in the 70s was the orange and avocado appliances. The color combination became popular when earthy colors suddenly began a trend. Kitchen walls and homes were painted in these color hues, but it didn't end there. Manufacturing companies took it one step further by making appliances like dishwashers, ovens, refrigerators, and others in these vibrant colors. Soon enough, a trend that was intended to embrace nature and evoke warmth became an eyesore. You couldn't match them with other colors, the color lacked versatility, and it was no longer aesthetically pleasing. Macra Decor, on the other hand, was a classic and natural bohemian aesthetic that was timeless and elegant depending on your taste. The DIY handcrafted charm took the 70s by storm and could be seen hanging on the walls of many homes or converted into furniture of some sort. Macrame decor was at its peak when weaving and knitting became a lucrative hobby. Aesthetic designs were made out of cotton, jute, twine, and hemp, and it added an organic and natural look to the home which wasn't bad, except for the fact that they were fragile, had an outdated look, and accumulated a lot of dust and debris over time. It made them look like one big piece of junk. The 1970s were greatly affected by tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. Many had lived in fear of a possible nuclear attack, while various precautions were taken by the government to reduce the impact if such a thing happened. The Cold War anxiety affected the daily lives of citizens as nations amassed nuclear weapons with a grand idea of mutually assured destruction. Duck and cover drills were taught in school to protect children in case of an attack, and daily surveillance was at an all-time high. Families were encouraged to build underground shelters, businesses were affected, and economic crisis persisted in many regions. These measures were a frequent reminder that it wasn't safe, and the Cold War lasted until 1991, until the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Can you believe they made 19,505 flash pinball machines?
There's nothing quite like the flashing lights and thrilling game sounds of the controversial game of the 70s, Pinball. This arcade game is an improved version of a French table game called Bagatelle. Pinball had always existed since the mid-20s, but would be banned in the early 40s, and that persisted well into the 70s. The pinball ban was mostly because the game resembled a slot machine generally found in a casino, and it made it a potential avenue for gambling and exploitation. The game was tied to gangs and immoral influence on youth, leading them to engage in unproductive activity. And at that time, there was a huge crime problem, and organizations would distribute pinball machines to exploit people. This led to the government banning the game until 1976 when it was lifted. The early pinball machines didn't have flippers, so you could only win by a stroke of luck. It made it much more of a gamble in the government's eyes, but the game would later be upgraded with features like flippers, which allowed the player to navigate the ball to different points, showing the game was that of skill and not of luck at all. Today, children are allowed to play pinball all they like, thanks to the Gottlieb Company, which added these fate-changing flippers. Interior decor in the 1970s was different, and one of the designs that was widely used in homes, offices, and even hotels would be wood paneling. Characterized by layering walls with thin sheets of polished wood material, it gave the home a more natural look. It was cozy and also helped for insulation, and the wood paneling used in the 70s was inexpensive plywood, sometimes made of composite materials that carried a wood grain pattern. It made it look like actual wood. The design gave homes a luxury wood-like finish without breaking the bank, but it wouldn't last long because the faux wood would lose its color and distinctive pattern quite quickly. As it grew older, the lack of durability and difficulty in removing it made it a poor choice for interior design. Wood paneling soon became a symbol of cheap and low-quality design over time. Home computers were a category of microcomputers that went on sale in the late 70s and 80s, which provided an affordable option for those who needed a domestic tool for non-technical users to get acquainted with computer skills. Clunky home computers often differed from those in professional spaces. They had less memory but excelled in the creation of graphics and were commonly used for word processing and video games. Most home computers consisted of a monitor, a central processing unit, and a keyboard, and had very little application. However, they were quite bulky, and some of the top titans of their time were the TRS-80, the Commodore PET 200, and the Apple II. Needless to say, these computers are mere relics compared to the multifunctional supercomputers of today. Color television had just come into use in the 70s, and TV antennas were a common feature that accompanied the cathode ray tube. These antennas allowed viewers to manually adjust the reception or find stronger signals while watching a show. You could turn the antenna in different directions to find signals in more clear channels, and TV antennas were usually thin, rabbit-eared shaped metals or single retractable and located at the top of the TV. These antennas were often fragile and susceptible to interference by literally anything at all. The passing of a vehicle, the rumble of thunder, the waves of other electrical appliances, anything could distort the picture quality and sound at any time. Adjusting the antenna was frustrating and sometimes took a long time when the signal was poor. Imagine having to fiddle with an antenna for many minutes in search of a more clear view while your favorite show was on the air. When car seat belts came into existence in the 50s, they were designed in different forms, and over time the three-point belt was retained. Seat belts were not a popular option with owners in the 70s and considered an inconvenience. People went without using them at all since they were neither enforced by law or culturally ingrained, and the earlier seatbelt designs were inflexible and didn't exactly work for different body types. Some claimed they were restrictive and expressed discomfort when using them, and it wouldn't be until the late 70s that the government made use of seatbelts mandatory in many regions. The earliest console TV and CRT came without a remote control. You can just imagine the inconvenience of having to get up and walk to the television every time you wanted to change the channel. You'd have to stand for a few minutes, tuning the adjustable knob to different stations until you found the channel or show of your choice. Then you had to make your way back to your seat with the intent of returning when your show ended. The absence of remote controls was a rather huge inconvenience, and no one realized it at the time. Most people were just fascinated with the new technology and didn't yet know what was possible in the coming years. If you missed the era of brown and yellow everything, well, you didn't miss anything at all. The consumer trend shifted towards a more earthy direction and affected everything around it. The warm palettes became a symbol of the 70s and frankly a bit monotonous. These colors were on furniture, kitchen appliances, cars, fast food chains like Burger King and McDonald's, as well as packaging brands like Pyrex and Tupperware. The colors made their way into the big screen as well. Whether you were watching Count Dracula or the abominable Dr. Phibius, there was an unusual amount of earth colors, and the overuse of colors soon led to visual fatigue, and the lack of creativity became boring. Manual crank windows in vehicles were a pain for both the driver and the passenger. Although power windows had already reached the market in the 70s, they were still not as common as the manual crank, so most cars came with a manual option. It was inefficient, often faulty, and sometimes the crank even fell off. As the car got older, the crank became stiffer and more difficult to turn, often requiring lubrication, strength, and some dexterity. With time, the manual crank was phased out, and the more efficient, easily operable power window took over the market. Lead paint and asbestos were widely used in the painting of homes, offices, and schools, at least until the late 70s when health awareness was at an all-time high. It was discovered that exposure to these toxic chemicals could lead to health problems like muscle pain, abdominal contractions, and headaches. Continued exposure would put the individual at risk of lung cancer, behavioral problems, and brain damage. Lead paint and asbestos, despite the health threat, took a while before they were banned in the late 70s and early 80s. This was because many new buildings contained asbestos and the cost of relocation was high. The 1970s birthed a new anti-conformist fashion trend that became widespread and began to seep into various aspects of life. It became necessary to create and enforce strict dress codes in schools and offices to promote discipline and safety and create a professional atmosphere. Dress codes were implemented mostly by individual school districts as well as employers who felt the need to protect their image. When these laws were introduced in schools, parents were not so keen on the rules as they meant extra expense, and therefore parents objected to them, and in years the effect of the dress codes would be visible, especially when it came to school. They helped to curtail gang violence, created an identity and image for the school, and also improved discipline and uniformity.
I'm told that to be in the height of trendy fashion these days, you've got to wear shoes like these.
You didn't live in the 70s until you rocked a pair of platform shoes. It may look like a circus act today, but these shoes were the peak of fashion back in the 70s. They were initially designed to avoid wet floors that often got water into the feet of those who were wearing shoes with small soles. They also became popular because they made you look taller. These shoes were the highlight of the era, a fashion statement that brought a touch of uniqueness to the overall attire. Platform shoes typically came with thick soles and thick heels and were worn by men and women alike. Cobblers often made the shoes hollow to make them lighter for movement. The disco-inspired fashion era popularized the high heel shoes, which were often 4 inches high or more. The shoes were so popular, they even made it to Hollywood, as John Travolta rocked the house with these popular shoes in the 1977 movie Saturday Night Fever. Even though the vintage shoes were associated with a culture, they soon became unpopular because they were often uncomfortable to wear, unsafe and impractical, as they were easy to get injured with a shoe that high. They were large and clunky, and people gravitated towards more conservative fashion. What are your thoughts on all of these things from the 70s? Be sure to let me know in the comments and like this video while subscribing to the channel and turning on your notifications so you never miss a great memory in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.